It was a quiet afternoon in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. But in the blink of an eye, an unsettling scene unfolded that would leave people talking for weeks. An elderly black woman, well into her golden years, was walking home from the local grocery store when she found herself surrounded by two officers. What started as a typical interaction quickly spiraled into something no one could have predicted. These officers, who were supposed to serve and protect, instead began to bully this fragile woman, questioning her, making her feel smaller with every word. She was visibly confused, hurt, and frustrated. What had she done to deserve this? The officer's tone was condescending and dismissive, clearly trying to exert their authority. One could sense the woman's vulnerability. Her age, her race, none of it seemed to matter to the officers who were determined to make their point. But as the situation began to escalate, something happened that no one expected. The tension in the air was palpable, and just as the officers prepared to take things even further, a sudden realization dawned on them. A realization so startling, so unexpected, that it caused their faces to go pale. They were no longer looking at just any elderly woman. They were now looking at the mother of someone they both feared and respected, someone whose name carried weight, someone whose influence reached far beyond their small town. But before the officers could react, the woman's son stepped forward. The look on their faces changed in an instant. No more condescension, no more bullying. They were suddenly apologetic, humble, completely different people than they had been just moments before. What was it about this son that had such a powerful effect? Who was he, and how had this unknown connection flipped the entire situation on its head? The answers to these questions weren't immediately clear. The story didn't just stop there. The truth, once revealed, would leave the officers shaken and the community stunned. What had happened to this woman, and what was it about her son that had left the officers so intimidated? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and the people who hold it. The officers stood frozen for a moment, their minds scrambling to process the sudden shift in their surroundings. What had just happened? What had they walked into? They had been so sure of themselves, so certain that this elderly black woman, who had no doubt been caught in some minor misunderstanding, was harmless. They were used to situations like this, a routine that they carried out hundreds of times. But now, the air felt different. The woman's frail stature suddenly seemed to hold more weight, and the once confident officers could feel it pressing down on them. The thought of who her son was made them nervous, though they couldn't place exactly why. The woman still standing in front of them wasn't even looking at them anymore. Her eyes, clouded by age, seemed to have hardened somehow. She was no longer the frightened woman caught off guard by their aggression. There was a quiet strength in her, an underlying resolve that had not been there when this had all started. She didn't flinch or shift her stance as the officers stared at her. One officer, a tall man with short, spiky hair, cleared his throat awkwardly and broke the silence. "Ma'am, we didn't mean to upset you. It's just we thought, well, you know." He trailed off, clearly unsure of what to say. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze darting between the elderly woman and his partner. The other officer, a woman who was slightly shorter but had a more imposing presence, didn't say anything at first. She was the first one to recognize that this wasn't just an ordinary moment, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she didn't fully understand the situation either. She had a look of hesitation, like she was trying to put the pieces together in her head. Whatever she thought might have been happening, it wasn't adding up anymore. "Ma'am, can you tell us her name?" the female officer asked, her voice softer now, as though trying to regain some semblance of control. She still didn't quite understand what had shifted, but she knew there was a bigger story here, one she hadn't been expecting. The elderly woman didn't immediately respond. She just stood there, her posture straightening slightly as she folded her arms. She was waiting for something, or maybe she was gathering her strength. She knew these officers didn't deserve an explanation from her, but she gave them one anyway. It was something that had been on her mind for a long time now, something that she'd always been afraid to say out loud. "My name is Gloria," she said slowly, her voice unwavering. "And I've lived in this town for longer than either of you have been alive." The officers exchanged a glance. Something in the air was changing. It was a small, subtle shift, but it was there. The mention of her son, something about it had them rattled. They both had their suspicions, but they weren't sure if they were ready to voice them just yet. But the way Gloria had said it, so calmly, so assured, made them both uneasy. The male officer swallowed hard and took a step back. He started to talk, but the words didn't quite come out right. We're just doing our job, ma'am. We had no idea." He trailed off, trying to find the right words but realizing he didn't have them. Gloria wasn't just any elderly woman. She wasn't even just any black woman. There was something more about her, something they had missed in their initial assessment. The female officer shot him a sharp look, almost as if to silence him. She cleared her throat, trying to maintain some authority. "What we're trying to say is, maybe we got this wrong. We just thought you were causing a disturbance, and—" "I wasn't causing any disturbance," Gloria interrupted, her voice cutting through the officer's words like a knife. "You decided I was. That's the problem, isn't it? You decided I was a problem before you even spoke to me." The officers fell silent again. There was a deep truth in what she said, one that neither of them could deny, no matter how hard they tried. They'd seen a black woman, an elderly one at that, and they had immediately assumed she didn't belong. They hadn't seen a community member. They hadn't seen a person who had lived her life with dignity, raising her children, working hard, and contributing to the town in ways that would never make the headlines. They had seen something else entirely, someone to control, someone to intimidate. Gloria's eyes softened a little, though there was still a lingering sadness there. She had seen it all before, the way people like her were treated differently, the way they were always presumed guilty before proven innocent. It had been a lifetime of this, and yet, somehow, it still stung every time. Then, as if to break the tension, she added, "You'll find out soon enough who my son is. And when you do, maybe you'll think twice before you pull something like this again." Her words lingered in the air, and the officers stood frozen, now more uncertain than ever. They hadn't expected any of this. They hadn't expected her to speak so boldly, to turn the situation back on them in such a calm but powerful way. And they definitely hadn't expected her son's name to hang in the air like a shadow, looming over everything. Gloria turned her back on the officers and began walking slowly toward her house, her pace measured and unhurried. The two officers watched her go, still reeling from the strange turn of events. They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. They had questions, plenty of them, but the one question that stood above all was the one that had been gnawing at them ever since she had mentioned her son. Who was he? It was a question that hung in the air like an unsolved puzzle. But as they stood there, contemplating the possibility of who her son could be, they didn't realize that time was slipping away. Soon they would find out, and when they did, it would change everything. But for now, all they could do was stand in silence, waiting for the inevitable revelation that would force them to confront their own biases, their own assumptions, and the power dynamics that had shaped their world for far too long. And when they did, it would be far too late to undo the damage that had already been done. As Gloria continued her slow walk back home, the officers stood rooted to the spot, still reeling from the implications of her words. The air was thick with tension, and neither of them could shake the nagging feeling that they had just crossed a line they shouldn't have. What if Gloria wasn't just a harmless old woman, the way they had so easily assumed? What if, in some twisted way, they had just done something they couldn't undo? The male officer, a young man with more bravado than experience, tried to shake it off. He was used to handling confrontations, used to being the one in control. But something about Gloria had made him feel powerless. It wasn't just the mention of her son, it was the way she carried herself. The way she stood her ground despite the age and vulnerability the world expected her to show. He felt a knot form in his stomach. Something wasn't right here. His partner, the female officer, was quieter, more contemplative. She hadn't spoken much during the confrontation, but she couldn't stop thinking about Gloria's last words. "You'll find out who my son is." The words echoed in her mind. Who was this son that had such an impact on her? And why did it seem to shake the very ground under their feet when she said it? She had seen enough to know that not all elderly people were just frail victims of time. Gloria had a fire in her. The woman officer glanced at her partner, who was still lost in thought, and sighed. "We need to get back to the station. We'll figure this out later. But we're not done here." The male officer barely nodded, still trying to make sense of it all. He didn't want to admit it, but a part of him was scared. Scared of what might happen when they found out who Gloria's son really was. Back at her house, Gloria stepped through the door, her heart still pounding. She didn't feel scared anymore, though. Instead, there was a sense of calm determination in her as she closed the door behind her. She hadn't been one to stay silent for long. Not after everything her community had been through, and certainly not after what had just happened. She walked down the narrow hallway, the scent of her old home wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. The creaky floorboards beneath her feet were a comforting reminder of all the years she had spent in this house. There was no going back to the way things were before. She knew that. The officers had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, but she wasn't afraid. Her son had taught her well. He had taught her not to back down, no matter who was in front of her. She moved to the kitchen and reached into the cupboard, pulling out a small, weathered photograph. It was an old picture, worn at the edges, of her son when he was younger. It had been taken at his high school graduation. Gloria had always kept this photo close by. She had been so proud of him that day, but it wasn't just because he had finished school. It was because she knew he was destined for something much bigger. She had always believed in him, even when the world didn't. She didn't know what had happened along the way, but her son had grown into someone powerful, someone who could make waves. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. She knew who it was even before she looked out the window. The car, sleek and dark, was a constant reminder that things had changed. Gloria wasn't the only one who had watched this small-town grow. Her son had too. But while the town had remained stuck in its ways, her son had moved on, far beyond the boundaries of a sleepy little place like this. She opened the door before he could knock. He didn't need to announce himself. She had been expecting him. "Mom," he said, his voice low but filled with affection. "You okay?" Gloria stepped aside, letting him in without a word. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her face. Something had happened, something that had rattled her. He had been away, but he always kept an ear to the ground, always stayed connected to the people who mattered. When he had heard what went down with the officers earlier, he had immediately known it was time to come home. "Tell me what happened," he said, his eyes searching hers. Gloria hesitated for just a moment. She didn't want to drag him back into this, didn't want to expose him to the ugliness of what had just occurred. But she knew, deep down, that her son wasn't someone who could ignore injustice. He wasn't someone who could pretend things were okay when they clearly weren't. "They came for me, son," she said quietly. "The officers. They thought I was some kind of troublemaker. The way they spoke to me, like I was nothing. They tried to push me around, make me feel small, but I didn't back down." Her son's expression hardened, the warm affection in his eyes replaced by a cold resolve. He had known there was a reason Gloria had raised him to be strong, to stand up for himself and others. But hearing it like this, hearing what those officers had done to his mother, something inside him snapped. "They don't know who they're dealing with," he muttered under his breath. "They're going to learn the hard way." Gloria's eyes softened, but there was a sadness in them too. "You don't have to do anything, son. I've handled it. It's just the way they think. They think they can get away with treating people like this." He was already moving, grabbing his jacket off the back of the chair. "No, Mom. This isn't just about you. This is bigger. It's about everything they've done to people like us all these years. It's time someone held them accountable." He stormed out of the house before she could stop him. Gloria stood in the doorway, watching him go. She knew her son was right. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. But she also knew that the road he was about to walk down would change everything. There was no going back from this. The officers had no idea what was coming for them, and neither did the rest of the town. But one thing was certain: the tension was building, and it was about to break. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The tension in the town grew heavier with every passing hour. Word spread fast, and soon, everyone knew about the confrontation between the officers and Gloria. Whispers spread through the local businesses, down the quiet streets, and into the homes of every neighbor. Some were sympathetic to Gloria, others questioned why she hadn't simply complied, and a few were already casting judgment on her son, who he was and what he might do next. But all Gloria could do was wait. She had done what she could to stand her ground. Her son was out there now, walking a path she couldn't follow. She knew he was determined, and she also knew that the more determined he became, the more dangerous this would get. She had lived through enough struggles in her lifetime to understand the weight of power and influence. But this felt different. She wasn't just worried about the officers anymore. She was worried about the ripple effect that would soon touch everyone. Meanwhile, her son had left the house in a storm of anger. He didn't care about the fallout, not now. All he cared about was setting things right, even if it meant shaking the very foundations of the town. His steps were quick, purposeful, as he made his way toward the station. He didn't know exactly how he was going to make them listen, but he knew he had to. As he neared the station, his mind raced. The officers had no idea who they had just crossed paths with. They had no idea about the people he had worked with, the alliances he had forged, and the resources at his disposal. Gloria had kept him grounded for years, but she had never hidden the truth about his potential, about what he could do if the right push came. And now that push had arrived. He stepped into the dimly lit police station, his presence immediate and unsettling. The room went quiet as soon as he entered, every officer's eyes darting to him. He was a man of few words, but the air around him was charged. There was a weight to his silence, a certainty that made the officers uncomfortable. One by one, they turned back to their duties, pretending not to notice him, but his eyes were fixed on the front desk. The desk officer looked up, recognition flashing across his face before he could hide it. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice shaky. The son didn't speak for a moment, simply staring the officer down. "You know exactly who I am," he finally said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. "And you know what I'm here for." The officer swallowed, glancing nervously at his colleagues. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The son's reputation preceded him. He was no stranger to the local law enforcement. He wasn't someone they wanted to cross. But they had crossed the line, and now it was his turn to make them feel it. "I want to speak to the officers who were involved in the incident earlier today," he demanded, his eyes never leaving the officer at the desk. "Now." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. He knew better than to ignore a direct order, but he wasn't sure how to defuse the situation without things escalating. "I'll go get them," he said, his voice quieter now, as if hoping the son would just leave. But he didn't. As the desk officer disappeared into the back room, the son remained in the lobby, his stance unyielding. His thoughts drifted back to his mother. She had raised him to be a fighter, but not in the way most people thought. Gloria had always told him that power wasn't about brute force. It was about knowing when to stand and when to let things unfold. But today, everything felt different. Today, he wasn't just standing for himself or his mother. He was standing for everyone who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or pushed aside. Minutes passed like hours, and the tension in the station was building. The officers who had been involved in the incident were talking among themselves in hushed tones, their anxiety palpable. They knew they had made a mistake. They had misjudged Gloria, treated her with disrespect, and now the consequences were about to unfold in a way none of them could have anticipated. Finally, the officers emerged from the back room, their expressions guarded. The male officer who had been the most vocal earlier stepped forward, his posture stiff. He tried to meet the son's eyes, but there was something different in his gaze now, something that spoke volumes about how much had changed in just a short time. The son didn't wait for them to speak. "You crossed a line today," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. "And I'm not going to let you pretend it didn't happen. You treated my mother with disrespect, and for that, you'll be held accountable." The female officer, who had been quieter during the confrontation, shifted uncomfortably. She could feel the weight of the son's words, the pressure building around her. "Look, we didn't mean to escalate thing." "No," the son cut her off, his voice sharper now. "You did, and you're going to face the consequences of that. I don't care if you were just following orders. That's no excuse for what you did." The room was silent, save for the sound of shuffling feet and nervous glances. The tension was thick, the officers unsure of what to say or do next. They had underestimated the situation. They had underestimated the power of Gloria's son. They thought they could get away with treating her however they pleased, but now they realized they had made a dangerous mistake. But just as the confrontation seemed to reach its boiling point, the door to the station burst open. Gloria's son turned, his eyes narrowing as a new figure walked in. It was the town's mayor, a man who had been watching this situation unfold from the sidelines, but knew that things were about to get out of hand. The mayor's presence shifted the energy in the room. He was an ally to the officers, someone who had the power to make or break careers in this small town. The son's eyes locked with the mayor's, and in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The stakes had just been raised, and the final moments of this confrontation were about to change the course of everything. But how far would it go? Would the mayor side with the officers, or would he stand with Gloria's son? Would this moment lead to the justice that Gloria and so many others had been waiting for, or would it be another instance of power and privilege pushing those who were already vulnerable further down? The tension was unbearable, and no one in that room knew where it would end. The mayor stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as if he had rehearsed this entrance. His sharp suit gleamed under the dim lights of the police station, a stark contrast to the tension that rippled through the air. The son's eyes locked onto him instantly, narrowing in suspicion. The mayor had been a figure of local power for years, always maintaining a distance from the conflicts that simmered beneath the surface. But now, his presence here could either diffuse the situation or set everything ablaze. "Gentlemen," the mayor said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge, "I believe there's been some misunderstanding here." He nodded toward the officers, then shifted his gaze to the son. "We don't need to escalate this any further, do we?" The son didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes burning with intent. "What are you doing here, Mayor?" His voice was quiet, but it carried weight, like a man who had already decided the outcome before anyone else had spoken. The mayor's expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of unease behind his cool exterior. "I'm here to ensure that everything is handled fairly, that's all." He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "No one needs to get hurt. No one needs to lose their job over a simple misunderstanding." But the son wasn't buying it. He could hear the underlying threat in the mayor's words. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about something much deeper, something the mayor was trying to keep buried. "Is that what you call it?" The son shot back, his voice rising. "A misunderstanding. You think that people in this town don't see through your game. Your officers tried to intimidate my mother today, and now you're here trying to smooth things over because you know it's not just about Gloria anymore, is it?" The mayor stiffened, his jaw tightening slightly. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're starting to make a mistake," he warned. His voice was lower now, less certain. The facade of control he had maintained for so long was starting to crack. Gloria's son stepped even closer. "No, the mistake was made when you thought I wouldn't stand up for my family. The mistake was thinking that you could intimidate people like us into silence. You thought this town was still yours to control, but it's not." His eyes flicked to the officers, who were shifting nervously. "And you're about to find out just how wrong you were." For a moment, there was silence. The mayor's confident demeanor faltered as he met the son's unwavering stare. The room felt like it had frozen in time, the tension so thick that it almost suffocated the air. The son had a fire in him, a fierce determination that had only grown stronger with every word he spoke. He wasn't backing down, not now, not when everything had already been set in motion. And then, just as the standoff seemed ready to reach its peak, the door to the station opened again. This time, it wasn't just another officer. It was someone much more unexpected, an investigator from the county sheriff's office, a tall man in his mid-40s with a no-nonsense look on his face. He stepped inside, and his eyes scanned the room quickly. But it wasn't the mayor or the officers who caught his attention. It was the son. He stepped inside, and his eyes scanned the room quickly. But it wasn't the mayor or the officers who caught his attention. It was the son, standing tall and defiant in the middle of the room. "Is everything all right here?" the investigator asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. He didn't wait for anyone to answer before his gaze shifted to the mayor. "I've been getting some reports, Mayor. Seems like your officers might have been involved in something, more than they're letting on." The mayor's face drained of color. The tension in the room escalated almost instantly, as if a new, dangerous layer of complexity had been added to the situation. Gloria's son hadn't expected this, but there it was. A new player in the game. "What reports?" the mayor asked, his voice almost trembling now. The investigator's lips curled into a tight smile. "You'll know soon enough. You see, there's more to this than a simple altercation between your officers and an elderly woman. Much more, and I'm not here to clean up anyone's mess this time." The words hit the room like a bombshell. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, while the mayor's face darkened. The investigator's presence was no coincidence. There was a bigger investigation unfolding, one that had the potential to expose not just the officer's actions, but the mayor's ties to things better left unspoken. "I suggest we all take a seat," the investigator continued, his tone firm. "This is going to take some time to explain." The son, still standing at the center of the room, turned toward the mayor. "What's going on here, Mayor? What have you been hiding?" The mayor's jaw clenched, his face reddening with barely contained anger. But before he could respond, the investigator raised his hand, signaling that it was time for the truth to come out. "You're about to find out," the investigator said, his voice steady. He looked directly at Gloria's son. "You were right. This isn't just about your mother anymore. This is much bigger than any of you realize." The son's heart skipped a beat. He had been sure he was just stepping into a confrontation, but now it seemed like he had inadvertently stumbled into something far more dangerous, something that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire town. The investigator turned to face the officers, his eyes sharp. "You've been under investigation for a while now, and everything you thought you could cover up, it's about to come to light. But it's not just the police force we're interested in." The words hung in the air, a promise of even darker secrets waiting to be revealed. Gloria's son had known that the officers had underestimated him, but he had no idea that this was the tip of the iceberg. As the weight of the investigator's words sank in, the entire room seemed to exhale in collective disbelief. The stakes had just been raised to a level no one had anticipated, and now no one in this small town could ignore what was about to unfold. What had seemed like a simple act of defiance against an unjust system had suddenly become the first spark in a much larger fire. Everything was about to change. The room fell silent as the investigator's words sank in. Gloria's son's mind raced, trying to process the weight of what was happening. The officers' faces had turned pale, their nervous glances now more pronounced. The mayor stood frozen, his confidence shattered, his facade crumbling under the pressure. The investigator stepped forward, his presence dominating the space. "You think you've been untouchable," the investigator continued, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "But every mistake you've made, every hidden action, it's all been tracked. You've been under investigation for months now, long before today's incident." He turned his gaze to the mayor. "And the truth is, you've been using your position for far more than anyone could have imagined." The mayor's face twisted in shock, his mouth opening but no words coming out. He took a step back, glancing nervously at the officers. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't in control anymore. The investigation wasn't just about the officers' misconduct, it was about him. The scandal, the corruption, the deals he'd made in the shadows of the town, it was all coming to light now. The investigator looked directly at Gloria's son. What started as a fight for justice for your mother, it's bigger now. It's about cleaning up this. Gloria's son's heart pounded in his chest. He had walked into this situation thinking he was fighting for his mother, for dignity, but now he understood he was fighting for much more. The truth was coming to the surface, and the ripple effect would be far-reaching. He glanced at the officers, who now stood with their heads down, their guilt written on their faces. The realization hit them all at once. The weight of their actions, the consequences they had avoided for so long, were now crashing down on them. Gloria's heart skipped a beat. She had thought it was over. But clearly, this wasn't the end. And as the investigator's words hung in the air, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The final twist had yet to be revealed. The room was thick with tension, every eye on the investigator as he stood before them. Gloria's son, his body still poised in defiance, exchanged a quick glance with his mother. She stood by his side now, her calm demeanor contrasting the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The moment they'd worked so hard for was here, but the investigator's final words hung in the air like an ominous cloud, threatening to obscure the victory they had just claimed. "There's one more thing," the investigator repeated, his voice grave. "Someone you need to speak to." Gloria's heart tightened. She had thought everything was finished. They had taken down the mayor, revealed the officers' corruption, and brought the truth to light. But this new revelation was the last thing she expected. She turned her gaze back to the investigator, waiting for him to explain. "Who?" Gloria's son asked sharply, his tone suddenly wary. The investigator took a deep breath. "Your mother knows him, though she might not realize it yet. And your name, son, might be more connected to this town's history than you've ever imagined." A chill ran through Gloria. She had spent years in this town, watched it grow, seen its faults and its good sides. But never once did she suspect that her son's name carried a weight heavier than she had realized. Her eyes flicked nervously to her son, whose expression had gone from confusion to a sharp realization. "Tell me," Gloria's son said, his voice steady, "who are you talking about?" The investigator turned to the door, signaling for someone to enter. When the door opened, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with a commanding presence, dressed in a well-tailored suit. Gloria's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. She hadn't seen him in years, but there was no mistaking that face. It was her father. He walked into the room with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes meeting hers with a sullen expression. Gloria stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed with emotions that she couldn't process. Her father, the man who had disappeared from her life without a word, the man who had abandoned her family when she was just a child. How was this possible? "Dad," Gloria whispered, barely able to breathe. The man's face softened slightly, and he nodded slowly. "I know you have questions, Gloria, but I think we need to talk." Gloria's son took a step back, his eyes moving between his mother and the man standing in front of them. He could feel the weight of the revelation settling over them all, but he could also sense that something much bigger was unfolding. His entire world had just shifted on its axis. The truth about his mother's past, about his own connection to the town, was about to be uncovered in a way that no one could have expected. The investigator cleared his throat. "This is Robert Anderson, Gloria's father, and he's been keeping a very close eye on this town for longer than anyone realizes." The room fell silent again. Gloria felt a mix of shock, confusion, and a strange sense of disbelief. Her father had been involved in everything that had been happening. In the corruption, the power struggles, the fear that had gripped the town for so long. "You're the one behind this?" Gloria's son asked, his voice low with incredulity. Robert Anderson's expression remained serious. "I didn't plan for things to happen this way. But after years of seeing the town fall deeper into corruption, I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I had to step in. Gloria felt the old, familiar rush of anger mixed with betrayal. You left us," she said, her voice cracking. "You abandoned me, and now you come back, after all these years, trying to fix what you helped break." Her father lowered his head, his face etched with regret. "I know I can't make up for what I did, but I wasn't just a bystander. I've been working behind the scenes, gathering evidence, building connections. I've seen the way things have gotten worse, and I couldn't allow your son to be caught in the middle of it." Gloria's son, still processing the shock of seeing his grandfather, turned toward the investigator. "You knew about this all along?" The investigator nodded. "I did. Robert reached out to me months ago when he realized things were spiraling out of control. We've been working together ever since, gathering intel and waiting for the right moment to make our move." Gloria's mind was spinning, trying to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. Her father, the man who had disappeared when she was a child, had been playing a long game in the shadows, trying to bring justice to the town he once called home. It was surreal, but there was one thing she was certain of now: he wasn't here to cause harm. As Robert Anderson stepped aside, it was clear that the long shadows of the past had finally been cast into the light. The officers would be held accountable. The mayor would face the consequences of his actions, and the town, once crippled by fear, would begin to heal. As Gloria stood with her son, she knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something new. The fight for justice, for the truth, was always ongoing. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was hope, a real chance for things to change. And as they walked out of the police station together, Gloria's son squeezed her hand, his voice filled with determination. "We did it, Mom. We changed everything." The final twist had come, but in the end, it was the courage of a family that had made all the difference. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it.